The vast emptiness of space stretched endlessly before Daniel's small exploration ship as it approached Vedra 9, a forgotten world lost to time. From orbit, the planet looked peaceful, endless forests of violet trees, winding silver rivers, and towering mountain peaks dusted with ice. But Daniel knew the truth. This world was a graveyard, its people long gone, leaving only broken ruins behind. Daniel wasn't a soldier or an adventurer. He was an archaeologist, a seeker of forgotten stories. He had spent years traveling from one abandoned world to another, digging through the remains of civilizations that no longer existed. Some people found it depressing, but not Daniel. To him, every ruin was a mystery waiting to be solved. His ship, Pathfinder, hummed softly as it entered the planet's atmosphere. The autopilot guided it toward the coordinates he had been given, an ancient temple-like structure buried in the middle of a dense jungle. The records suggested that this place had once been a thriving city, home to an advanced alien race. No one knew what had happened to them, only that one day they had vanished. As his ship landed with a soft thud on the grassy ground, Daniel took a deep breath. The air was surprisingly fresh, rich with the scent of alien flowers. He grabbed his scanner, a small device that could read the structure of ruins and map them out, and stepped outside. The temple loomed before him, its stone walls covered in twisting patterns that glowed faintly under the sunlight. Vines and moss had crept over the entrance, but the structure itself was still strong. He approached carefully, scanning the area. The ruins were silent, but there was something in the air, a strange energy, a feeling that made the hair on his arms stand up. Daniel hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The temple's interior was massive, with high ceilings and wide corridors. Sunlight streamed through cracks in the walls, casting patterns of light and shadow across the floor. His footsteps echoed as he moved forward, dust rising with each step. The deeper he went, the stronger the strange energy became. It wasn't dangerous, at least not yet, but it was definitely unusual. He adjusted his scanner, trying to pinpoint the source. That was when he noticed something strange. The ruins were too clean. Most ancient sites were filled with broken walls, collapsed ceilings, and scattered debris. But here, everything was intact. The carvings on the walls weren't just faded markings. They looked almost alive, their glow pulsing softly, like a heartbeat. A shiver ran down his spine. "All right," he muttered to himself. "Let's see what's hiding in here." As he moved deeper into the temple, he found a massive circular door at the end of the hallway. Unlike the rest of the ruins, this door was sealed tight, untouched by time. Strange symbols ran along its surface, glowing brighter as he stepped closer. His scanner beeped wildly, struggling to understand the energy coming from it. "This isn't normal," Daniel murmured, placing a hand on the cool stone. Before he could react, the symbols flared with brilliant light. The ground trembled beneath him, and the door slowly began to open with a deep, rumbling sound. Dust and ancient air rushed out, and Daniel stumbled back, shielding his eyes. When the dust cleared, he saw her. A figure lay inside a circular chamber, her body resting on a raised platform. She was tall, far taller than any human, maybe 10 feet at least. Her skin had a soft, golden hue, marked with faint, glowing patterns that ran across her arms and legs. Her long silver hair cascaded around her shoulders, unmoving. She wasn't just a statue or a preserved body. She was breathing. Daniel's heart pounded as he took a cautious step forward. Impossible. The scanners had said nothing about any living beings on this planet, and yet here she was, asleep for who knew how long. Who was she? Why was she here? As if sensing his thoughts, her eyes fluttered open. They were bright, glowing gold, filled with confusion and something else. Recognition. She looked at Daniel, her gaze piercing through him like she could see straight into his soul. Then, in a voice that was both powerful and soft, she spoke a single word. A word in a language he didn't understand. But somehow, deep inside, he knew exactly what it meant. Who are you? Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the towering figure before him. The alien woman, if she could even be called that, was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her golden skin shimmered under the dim temple light, her glowing patterns pulsing like a quiet heartbeat. But it was her eyes that held him in place. Deep, bright gold, filled with something ancient, something powerful. She had spoken. A single word, unfamiliar yet strangely clear in his mind. Who are you? Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He opened his mouth, but his voice caught. What was he supposed to say? He was standing in front of a living being from a lost civilization, something no human had ever encountered before. He swallowed hard. My name is Daniel. The alien woman didn't move. She only watched him, her gaze intense, unreadable. Slowly, cautiously, Daniel lifted his hands, palms up, in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. I'm not here to hurt you, he said carefully. I'm just an explorer. I found this place by accident. She tilted her head slightly, her silver hair falling over her shoulders. The glow of her skin brightened for a brief moment, then faded again. Daniel pointed to himself. Daniel. Then, hesitantly, he pointed to her. The woman's lips parted, and after a moment of silence, she spoke. Alara. Daniel exhaled in relief. A name. A connection. She was still weak. He could see it in the way her fingers trembled slightly when she shifted. How long had she been in that chamber? Centuries. Maybe even longer. Daniel carefully reached for his scanner, but Alara tensed at the movement, her golden eyes narrowing. He froze. It's okay, he said gently. He turned the device around, showing her the screen. This just scans things. No harm. Alara watched him for a long moment before relaxing slightly. Daniel activated the scanner and held it over her. The readings made no sense. Her body was emitting energy. An energy that wasn't just biological, but something else entirely, something powerful. The scanner flickered, struggling to process the data. All right, he muttered. I don't understand any of this. Alara slowly pushed herself up from the platform, her movements graceful despite her exhaustion. As she stood, her full height became even more apparent. Daniel barely reached her waist. Up close, her presence was overwhelming, not just because of her size, but because of the quiet strength that radiated from her. She took a step forward. Daniel instinctively stepped back, but the temple floor was uneven, and his foot caught on a loose stone. He stumbled, arms flailing. Before he could hit the ground, Alara moved. Her hands shot out, catching him with surprising gentleness. For a moment, they were frozen in place. Daniel staring up at her, Alara watching him with a curious expression. Her hands were warm, her skin smooth yet firm. He felt an odd hum beneath her touch, like standing close to a quiet, hidden source of energy. Alara tilted her head again, studying him. Then, to his surprise, the corners of her lips lifted slightly. Was that a smile? Daniel cleared his throat and straightened himself. Thanks. Alara took a step back, her glowing markings dimming slightly as she looked around. Her gaze swept over the ruins, and something in her expression changed. Her golden eyes darkened with sadness. She walked past him, her fingers trailing along the ancient walls. She touched the carvings, the symbols that had glowed earlier. This place meant something to her. Daniel followed, keeping a respectful distance. This was your home, wasn't it? He asked softly. Alara didn't respond. She simply placed a hand on one of the walls. The markings brightened under her touch, reacting to her presence. The temple itself seemed to recognize her. Then, without warning, the air around them shifted. A deep, low hum filled the chamber. The carvings along the walls flared to life, glowing brighter than before. Symbols flickered, moving like flowing water, forming patterns Daniel had never seen. What's happening? He asked. stepping closer. Alara's eyes widened. She turned to him, speaking in her language, words Daniel couldn't understand. But her tone was urgent. She pointed at the walls, at the symbols, then back at him. Daniel looked at the markings. They weren't just glowing randomly. They were forming shapes, images, a story. One symbol showed a world, Vedra 9. Another showed towering beings like Alara, a civilization. But then the images darkened. Strange, mechanical shapes loomed over the land. Fires, destruction. And finally, one last image, Alara, alone, sealed within the temple. Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't just a ruin, he whispered. This was a warning. Alara turned to him, her golden eyes filled with something heavy. She stepped forward, placing a hand on his chest, just over his heart. The moment she touched him, a surge of warmth spread through his body, like an echo of the energy that surrounded her. Then she spoke, this time slower, clearer. Danger comes. Daniel's stomach dropped. She wasn't just the last of her kind. She was a guardian. And whatever had destroyed her people, it was coming back. The air inside the temple felt heavier now, charged with a strange energy that made Daniel's skin tingle. The glowing symbols on the walls pulsed like a heartbeat, casting shifting patterns of light across the ancient stone. Alara stood beside him, silent but focused. She had spoken only 2 words in his language. Danger comes, but that was enough to send a chill through his spine. Daniel swallowed hard and looked at her. What kind of danger? Alara's golden eyes studied him for a moment. Then, slowly, she turned toward the wall and raised a hand. The markings reacted instantly, glowing brighter under her touch. The symbols shifted again, forming new images. Daniel watched closely. The story unfolded in simple, almost fluid motion. First, a grand city, towering structures filled with Alara's people. They were tall like her, glowing with the same strange energy, living in harmony. Then the sky darkened. Strange, metallic objects descended. Ships, unlike anything Daniel had seen before. The peaceful city turned to chaos. The symbols showed figures running, buildings collapsing, the once thriving civilization reduced to ruin. But the last image was the most unsettling. A shape, huge, towering over the destruction. Its form unclear but unmistakably unnatural. It was surrounded by swirling dark energy, a presence that seemed to consume everything around it. And then nothing. Just silence. Daniel let out a slow breath. Your people, they were wiped out. He turned to Alara, his voice softer. And you were put in this temple. Why? To survive. Alara hesitated, then shook her head. She placed a hand on her chest, then pointed toward the symbols. Daniel frowned, trying to understand. You were meant to stop this. She nodded. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. His mind raced with possibilities. If this was true, then whatever had destroyed Alara's people wasn't just history. It was still out there. And worse, it was coming back. His scanner beeped, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen, and his stomach tightened. Unusual energy readings, not from the temple, from outside. Daniel's hands tightened around the scanner. We have a problem, he muttered. Alara tilted her head slightly, sensing his concern. Daniel turned toward the entrance of the temple. Something's moving out there. Alara didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her movements smooth and controlled despite the clear exhaustion she felt. She was weak from centuries of stasis, but there was still a strength in her posture, a presence that made Daniel feel oddly reassured. As they reached the entrance, Daniel switched his scanner to infrared. The screen flickered, struggling to process the strange energy in the air. Then, a faint shape appeared, a shifting, moving presence at the edge of the ruins. It was watching them. Daniel clenched his jaw. That's not good. Alara took a slow step forward, her glowing markings brightening slightly. Whatever was out there, She could sense it too. Then, without warning, the presence moved. A rustling sound echoed through the trees, followed by a low mechanical hum. It wasn't a natural sound. It was something artificial, something unnatural. Daniel took a step back. We need to move. Now. Ayla returned to him, understanding in her eyes. She grabbed his arm, not roughly, but firmly, and pulled him back inside the temple. The moment they crossed the threshold, she raised a hand toward the walls. The temple responded. A wave of golden light surged through the carvings, flowing outward like ripples in water. The air hummed with raw energy, and the walls seemed to pulse in response. The rustling outside stopped. Silence. Daniel held his breath. He checked his scanner again. Whatever had been out there was no longer visible. The energy signature had faded. Ayla lowered her hand, her breathing unsteady. Daniel exhaled. That was close. Ayla glanced at him, her golden eyes filled with something unreadable. Then she gestured toward the symbols again. Daniel followed her gaze. The markings had changed once more, forming a final image. A planet. Not Vedra-9. A different world. Unfamiliar, with the same dark energy swirling around it. Daniel frowned. What is this? Ayla placed a hand over her heart again. Future. Daniel felt a chill. This wasn't just a memory. It wasn't just history. It was a warning. And if they didn't act soon, the past was going to repeat itself. A heavy silence filled the ancient temple, broken only by the faint hum of glowing symbols on the walls. Daniel stared at the last image. The unknown planet, surrounded by the same dark energy that had destroyed Ayla's people. His fingers tightened around his scanner. The message was clear. The threat wasn't just returning to Vedra-9. It was already moving somewhere else. He turned to Ayla. She stood motionless, her golden eyes fixed on the carvings. Her glowing patterns flickered, dim and uneven. She was exhausted, but she didn't show it. Daniel took a slow breath. We need to talk. Ayla looked at him, her expression unreadable. Daniel tapped his chest. I don't understand everything you're saying. He pointed at her. And you don't understand everything I'm saying. Ayla tilted her head slightly. He held up his scanner. This can help. It has a translation program. It's not perfect, but it might work. Ayla watched him carefully as he adjusted the settings. He found an old language learning module and activated it. The device would record their speech, compare patterns, and try to build a basic understanding. Daniel gestured for her to speak. Say something. Ayla hesitated, then placed a hand over her heart. Ayla. Daniel nodded. Ayla. He pointed to himself. Daniel. Ayla repeated his name, her voice soft but steady. Encouraged, Daniel pointed at the temple walls. Ruins. Ayla's eyes flickered with understanding. Veshar. Daniel typed the word into his scanner, saving it. He then pointed at the symbols. History. Ayla considered, then spoke. Zyron. They continued like this, exchanging words, building a basic vocabulary. It was slow, frustrating at times, but progress was progress. After a while, Ayla stepped forward and touched one of the glowing symbols. Nivar. Daniel frowned. Nivar. She nodded, then pointed at the last image, the one showing the dark energy surrounding the unknown planet. Daniel's stomach tightened. The thing that destroyed your people, that's Nivar. Ayla's expression darkened. She gave a single firm nod. Daniel exhaled. All right, now we're getting somewhere. He sat down on a fallen stone, rubbing his forehead. So Nivar is still out there, and it's moving to another planet. He looked up at her. Do you know where? Ayla hesitated. Then, instead of speaking, she closed her eyes. The glowing markings on her skin brightened slightly. A faint hum filled the air. And for a moment, Daniel swore he could feel something, an invisible presence, like a distant echo of energy. Alara opened her eyes. She raised her hand and drew a simple shape in the air, using the light from her fingertips, a circle with 2 small moons orbiting it. Daniel's breath caught. He recognized that shape. "That's not just any planet," he muttered. "That's Yara 3. Alara gave him a questioning look. Daniel stood up quickly, checking his scanner. Yara 3 is a colony world. Human colony. He looked at her sharply. Never isn't just attacking alien worlds anymore. It's coming for us. Alara's glowing patterns flared suddenly, her posture shifting. She understood what that meant. Daniel paced back and forth, trying to think. I need to send a message to my ship. If we can warn the colony, they might have time to evacuate. He tapped his wrist communicator. Pathfinder, come in. Silence. He frowned. Pathfinder, respond. Nothing. Alara was already moving. She gestured for him to follow her deeper into the temple. He didn't know where she was going, but at this point, he had no better options. They passed through ancient corridors until they reached a chamber Daniel hadn't seen before. In the center stood a massive stone pedestal, covered in glowing symbols. Alara placed her hands on the surface, and the room responded immediately. A beam of golden light shot up from the pedestal, forming a holographic display above them. Floating symbols and diagrams spun in midair. Daniel's eyes widened. Is this a communication system? Alara nodded. He stepped forward, pulling out his scanner. If he could connect it to the temple system, he might be able to boost his signal. He quickly accessed his ship's emergency channel and tried again. This is Daniel. Can anyone hear me? Static. Then, Aniel, that you? Daniel's heart leaped. Yes. Pathfinder, respond. The voice on the other end crackled. Signal. Weak. Interference. Alara watched him, waiting. Daniel tightened his grip on the scanner. Listen, this is urgent. Yara 3 is in danger. Something called Nevar is heading there. We need to warn them. The signal cut off. Daniel cursed under his breath. He looked at Alara. I don't know if they got the message. Alara studied him for a long moment. Then she placed a hand on his shoulder. For the first time, Daniel truly felt the warmth of her presence, not just the physical warmth of her touch, but something deeper, a silent understanding. They were in this together now. Alara stepped back and pointed toward the exit of the temple. Then she made a simple motion, lifting her hand and moving it forward, as if pushing something ahead. Daniel understood. We go to Yara 3. Alara nodded. Daniel exhaled. He had come to Vedra 9 expecting to find old ruins and forgotten history. Instead, he had found something far greater, a lost guardian, an ancient enemy, and a mission that could decide the fate of an entire world. He looked at Alara one last time before turning toward the jungle outside. Let's go save some lives. The jungle outside the temple was eerily silent. The air was thick with humidity, and the twin moons of Vedra 9 cast a pale glow over the ruins. Daniel adjusted his backpack, glancing at Alara. She moved with quiet grace, her glowing markings dim in the moonlight. Their destination was clear, his ship. It was their only way off this planet, the only way to reach Yara 3 before it was too late. But something still bothered him. The strange presence they had sensed earlier. Daniel checked his scanner again. The energy readings were faint, but they were still there. Something had been watching them. Something that had disappeared the moment Alara activated the temple's defenses. Alara noticed his hesitation. Danger? She asked, her voice still unfamiliar with his language, but clear enough to understand. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Maybe. She glanced at the trees, her golden eyes scanning the shadows. Then, without a word, she continued forward. Daniel followed, gripping his scanner tightly. They traveled for nearly an hour, weaving through the dense jungle. The ground was uneven, covered in thick roots and strange bioluminescent plants. Daniel had made this trip once before, when he first arrived. But now, every step felt heavier. Alara was silent most of the way, but every now and then, she would glance at the sky. Her glowing markings flickered, as if reacting to something unseen. Daniel finally broke the silence. "You sense something, don't you?" Alara slowed her steps. Then she nodded. "Nivar watches." Daniel's stomach tightened. "It's here." Alara shook her head. "Far, but close." That didn't make sense. How could something be far and close at the same time? Daniel exhaled. There was no point worrying about it now. They had to get off this planet first. After another 20 minutes of walking, they finally reached the clearing where his ship was docked. The Pathfinder stood tall and sturdy, its sleek metal surface reflecting the moonlight. It wasn't a massive ship, but it was fast and reliable, the perfect explorer's vessel. Daniel let out a breath of relief. "We made it." Alara stepped closer, her eyes scanning the ship with curiosity. It was clear she had never seen human technology before. Daniel walked up the ramp and tapped the control panel. "All right, let's get this thing running." The ship's systems powered up with a low hum. Lights flickered on inside the cockpit, and the engines began their warm-up sequence. Daniel sat in the pilot's chair, scanning the controls. Everything looked normal. He turned to Alara. "Take a seat. This might be a rough ride." She hesitated for a moment, then sat down beside him. Even in the spacious cockpit, her tall frame made the seat seem small. Daniel activated the thrusters. "Here we go." The ship vibrated as it lifted off the ground. The jungle below shrank away as they soared into the sky, breaking through the atmosphere within minutes. For the first time since he arrived on Vedra 9, Daniel felt like he could breathe again. But his relief didn't last long. As soon as they entered orbit, the warning alarms went off. "Incoming energy signet UREDT." Daniel's heart pounded. He quickly pulled up the radar. A faint signal was approaching from the dark side of the planet. It was small, but moving fast. Alara tensed beside him. She didn't need a translator to understand what was happening. Daniel tightened his grip on the controls. "Hang on." The object streaked toward them, leaving a faint trail of dark energy in its wake. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't natural, either. It was something else. Something alien. Alara's markings flared. She raised a hand, and for a brief moment, Daniel felt the air around them shift. An invisible pulse of energy radiating from her. The dark object hesitated. Then, without warning, it veered away, disappearing into the void of space. The alarms went silent. Daniel's hands were still tight on the controls. His breath came fast, his heart pounding in his chest. What was that? Alara's expression was grim. "Nivar watches." Daniel swallowed hard. That thing, it wasn't an attack. It was a message, a warning. Nivar knew they were coming. And it wasn't afraid. Daniel exhaled, steadying himself. "We keep going." Alara nodded. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no doubt, only determination. Daniel turned his attention back to the navigation system. He locked in the coordinates for Yara 3. The engines roared to life, and within moments, the Pathfinder leaked into the stars, streaking toward their destination. They had a long journey ahead, but one thing was clear. The fight had already begun. The Pathfinder moved through the vastness of space, its engines humming steadily. The stars stretched endlessly around them, but Daniel's focus remained locked on the navigation screen. They were just a few hours away from Yara 3. Alara sat beside him, silent but alert. Her golden eyes studied the swirling patterns of light outside the window, her glowing markings faint but steady. Daniel glanced at her. "You okay?" She turned to him, considering his words before giving a small nod. Yes. It was a simple answer, but her posture told him more. She was tense, worried. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "We'll make it in time," he said, more to reassure himself than her. Alara didn't respond. She just kept watching the stars. Hours passed in silence. Then the proximity alarm beeped. Daniel's hands flew to the controls. "We're here." The ship slowed as Yara 3 came into view. It was a beautiful planet, covered in blue oceans and green landmasses, with 2 small moons orbiting closely. The colony lights flickered faintly from the surface, signs of human civilization thriving in the alien world. But something was wrong. Daniel's scanner picked up unusual readings. The energy signatures around Yara 3 were strange, distorted. Alara sat up straight, her glowing markings flickering. She sensed it too. Daniel activated the comms. "This is the Pathfinder calling Yara 3. Do you copy?" Silence. He tried again. "Yara 3, this is Daniel. Do you read me?" A few seconds passed. Then, "Lo, who is?" The signal was weak, filled with static. Daniel leaned forward. "This is Daniel, an explorer from the Pathfinder. I have an urgent warning. You're in danger." The voice on the other end crackled. "What?" "Talking. Trouble." Daniel's blood ran cold. Something was interfering with the signal. Alara suddenly gasped, her glowing patterns flaring. She gripped the edge of the console, eyes wide with shock. Daniel spun to face her. "What is it?" She pointed toward the window. Daniel followed her gaze, and then he saw it. A shadow, barely visible against the stars. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't natural. It was something massive, a dark shape drifting in the distance, its form shifting like a living void. Tendrils of black energy stretched outward, pulsing with an eerie glow. Daniel's heart pounded. "Nivar." Alara nodded, her expression grim. "It here." Daniel's instincts screamed at him to turn the ship around, to flee before it noticed them. But he knew that wasn't an option. Yara 3 was below them. Thousands of lives were at stake. He tightened his grip on the controls. "We have to warn them." Alara placed a hand on his arm. "No time." Daniel's stomach twisted. "Then we fight." Alara hesitated, then gave a single firm nod. Daniel exhaled sharply. He wasn't a soldier. He was an explorer. But right now, none of that mattered. He activated the ship's weapon systems. The Pathfinder wasn't built for war, but it had basic defense cannons. They would have to be enough. Alara stepped forward, placing her hands against the ship's control panel. Her glowing markings pulsed, and suddenly, the ship's lights flickered. Daniel's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" Alara didn't answer. A soft hum filled the air, and the ship's energy levels spiked. Daniel checked the readings. "Wait, are you boosting the shields?" Alara gave a small nod, her face tight with focus. Daniel let out a breath. "All right, let's do this." He aimed the weapons at the shadow and fired. Bolts of energy shot through space, striking the dark mass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the shadow moved. It twisted unnaturally, shifting toward them like a slow-moving wave. Daniel's scanner beeped wildly. The energy readings were off the charts. "Brace yourself," he shouted. The ship lurched violently as a wave of dark energy struck them. The shields held, but barely. Alara gasped, struggling to maintain her connection to the ship. Her glowing patterns flickered dangerously, as if she was using too much energy. Daniel gritted his teeth. Come on. The shadow loomed closer. Then, without warning, Alara let out a sharp breath and raised both hands. A pulse of golden light shot from her fingertips, spreading across the ship's hull. The energy wave expanded outward, colliding with the dark mass. The shadow recoiled. Daniel's eyes widened. It's working. Alara's face was tense with concentration. More power. Daniel quickly diverted more energy to the shields. The ship hummed with renewed strength. Alara took a deep breath, then unleashed another pulse of golden energy. This time, The shadow screamed. The sound wasn't physical. It was felt, vibrating through the ship, rattling Daniel's bones. The dark mass shuddered, then suddenly pulled back. Within seconds, it vanished into the void, leaving only silence behind. Daniel slumped back in his seat, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Did we win? Alara swayed slightly, exhaustion clear on her face, but she gave a small nod. For now. Daniel exhaled. He didn't know how, but they had survived. Alara had faced the darkness before, and she had fought it again. Daniel turned his gaze toward Yara 3 below them. The colony was still intact. They had bought them time. But the fight wasn't over. Nivar wasn't gone. It was still out there, watching, waiting. Daniel clenched his fists. We need to land. We have to warn the colony. Alara straightened herself. Despite her exhaustion, her golden eyes burned with determination. They weren't just explorers anymore. They were protectors, and their battle had only just begun. The Pathfinder descended toward Yara 3, cutting through the planet's atmosphere with streaks of fire trailing behind. The colony below came into full view, small but strong, its buildings scattered across the lush green land. Towering communication arrays blinked in the distance, their signals weak and unstable. Daniel gripped the controls tightly. The battle in space had drained the ship's energy, and they were coming in fast. Hold on, he shouted. Alara braced herself, her glowing markings faint from exhaustion. The ship hit the ground hard, skidding across the dusty terrain before coming to a shuddering stop just outside the colony's perimeter. Alarms blared, but the hull had held. Daniel exhaled. We're down. Alara let out a slow breath, steadying herself. She was drained from using her energy against Nivar, but there was no time to rest. Daniel unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed his scanner. Come on, we have to warn them. Alara nodded and followed him down the ramp. The colony was eerily silent. The streets were empty, doors locked, and lights flickering uncertainly. Daniel raised his voice. Hello? Is anyone here? A few moments later, a door creaked open. A man stepped out cautiously, his uniform marked with the insignia of the colony's security team. He held a weapon, but his grip was uncertain. Who are you? Daniel raised his hands. Name's Daniel. I came to warn you. Your colony is in danger. The man frowned. We already know that. Daniel exchanged a glance with Alara. What do you mean? The man's face was grim. Strange things started happening 2 days ago. Shadows moving where they shouldn't. Power surges. People hearing whispers at night. He shook his head. And then, last night, 3 of our people disappeared. No trace. Daniel's stomach dropped. It's already here. Alara stepped forward. Nivar. The man's eyes narrowed. What? Daniel turned back to him. It's an entity. A force. It destroyed Alara's people, and now it's coming for us. The man's face turned pale. Before he could respond, the ground shook. A deep, unnatural hum filled the air, sending vibrations through the ground. The colony's lights flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Alara's markings flared suddenly. She spun around, her golden eyes locking onto the dark horizon. It comes. Daniel turned to the security officer. Get your people inside. Now. The man didn't argue. He ran back, shouting orders. Alara stepped beside Daniel. Her glowing patterns brightened, her energy returning despite her exhaustion. She raised a hand, palm glowing with golden light. Then, out of the darkness, it came. A shadowy mass, shifting and twisting like living smoke, slithered toward the colony. Tendrils of black energy stretched forward, latching onto the buildings. Lights shattered. The air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural silence. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. How do we stop it? Alara closed her eyes. Light. Daniel frowned. What? She turned to him, placing a hand over her heart. Nivar feeds on fear, on darkness. But my people, we were protectors. We held the light. Daniel stared at her, realization dawning. You can fight it. Alara nodded. Daniel tightened his grip on his scanner. Then let's do it. Alara stepped forward, facing the monstrous shadow. She raised both hands, and her markings exploded with golden light. The darkness recoiled. A sharp, unnatural screech filled the air, vibrating through the colony like a living storm. Daniel stumbled back, shielding his eyes as Alara's energy flared brighter. The golden light pulsed outward, crashing into the shadow like a wave. Nivar screamed. The darkness twisted, retreating, but it wasn't giving up. It lashed out, sending tendrils of shadow whipping toward Alara. Daniel's heart pounded. Alara. But she didn't falter. She took a deep breath, then pushed. A final pulse of golden energy erupted from her, lighting up the entire colony like a second sun. The shadow shattered. The tendrils snapped, dissolving into the air. The heavy hum vanished, and the suffocating silence lifted. For the first time in days, the colony was still. Daniel exhaled shakily. Did we? Alara swayed. Daniel lunged forward, catching her just as she collapsed. Stay with me. Her markings were dim now, flickering weakly. Daniel felt a rush of panic. Alara, come on, talk to me. She blinked slowly. Then, with a faint smile, she whispered, safe. Daniel swallowed hard. She had given everything to stop Nivar, and she had won. By morning, the colony was alive again. People came out of their homes, confused but relieved. The dark presence was gone. Daniel sat beside Alara, who was resting in the shade of a tree. Her energy was slowly returning, her markings glowing faintly in the morning light. The security officer approached. I don't know what you two did, but thank you. Daniel gave a tired smile. Don't mention it. The man hesitated, then nodded toward Alara. Is she gonna be okay? Daniel glanced at her. Alara met his gaze, her golden eyes filled with quiet strength. She'll be fine, Daniel said. The officer exhaled, relief washing over his face. Well, if you two ever need a place to stay, you're welcome here. Daniel nodded. Appreciate it. As the officer walked away, Daniel turned back to Alara. So, what now? Alara tilted her head slightly. Then she reached out, placing a hand over Daniel's. A warm glow passed between them, soft, steady, and full of understanding. Daniel felt something shift inside him. This journey had started as an exploration, a simple search for ruins. But now, everything was different. He wasn't just an explorer anymore. He was part of something greater. Alara smiled. Together. Daniel smiled back. Yeah, together. And as the sun rose over Yara 3, they sat side by side. Two beings from different worlds, united by something neither of them had expected. Hope.